What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I am the design lead of Summoners Rift Team's live pod, here to talk about patch 14.9 coming live to a server near you. There is a lot going on in this patch. Not all of it is Summoners Rift Team stuff. I think it's a pretty cool patch overall. A lot of nerfs for the Summoners Rift game mode. Of course, Arena gonna have their own balance. Vanguard coming out. I'm personally very excited about that as a League player. Lee Sin ASU, also very cool. Used to be a champ I played a lot of. Either way, really cool stuff. A crap ton of skins they had to redo as well. Yeah, so rank split 1 ending fairly soon. Basically is going to coincide with patch 14.10. There is a dev article that came out today that talked about the kind of stuff in 14.10. Some of that came from seasonal, some of that came from live. Probably later on this week I will do a video talking about the hows and whys of the projects that LivePod took on for 14.10. They'll probably take over the spot of what would normally be the preview. Regardless, we can talk about the PvE stuff a little bit later on this week. Anyway, yeah. Split 2 is going to start after 14.10 goes live, of course. Okay, great. Arena is coming out. Cool stuff here. As I mentioned, one of the SRT live designers had hit rank 1 last time Arena came out. He's been spending now the majority of his time. Before it was a quarter, then it was half. Now it's most of his time is being spent doing Arena balance. So a literal rank 1 player is doing Arena balance for Arena here. I know he's been watching a lot of PvE stuff and spending his time there. So he's been busy, and so 14.9 fell a little bit more onto my shoulders individually as how this patch went. Anyway, Arena is super sick. A bunch of balance changes, again, courtesy of a former and current SRT live designer. Okay, whatever. We're trying something out this patch, which is bucketing the changes into generically, here are the big things, and then here are the stuff that's like, you could ignore it if you want a TLDR. Let me know how this feels to you. Sort of contrasting big versus small. Ultimately, it's kind of individual choice. I ended up like picking out which things would go into big, which ones would go into small. Anyway, here we are, big gameplay changes. Up first, a redesign on Hex Drinker and Maw of Melmortius. I talked about this more at length in the patch preview from last week, but TLDR, don't want Hex Drinker and Maw to be a really, really good lane checkmating first item rush. And so, in fact, Hex Drinker is going to be literally a weaker item to sit on the component of. While still not being a bad item, Hex Drinker is more than good already. Don't get me wrong, this item is not weak in any way. But the big thing is a redesign on Maw. And while doing the design work on this, I ended up doing the design work on the light fighter item reshape here, was I just kept thinking of Riven, basically. I spent time earlier, still April, right? So early this month, I spent time looking at Riven's historic pick, ban, and win rates, and her biggest day-to-day or patch-to-patch win rate changes were actually not individual Riven balance changes, but systems changes around how strong and what kind of items were out there. So I think right now, Riven probably feels a bit weak because I think the fighter item system does not serve her well. Now, I want to be clear that I think the fighter item system is in a very good state otherwise. That if you are not a very squishy, high AD, high haste light fighter, practically a caster, the kind of items that like Jace would want, that if you are not that kind of champion, I think fighter items are in a very good state in terms of fighters are actually durable, fighters are playing for a lot of repeated damage. There are outliers, don't get me wrong. I don't like Profane Hydra Aatrox, for example. At some point, we'll have time to take on that work, just not today. But I think if you're, let's say, Fiora or something, you've actually still got Rav Hydra's pretty solid on you, Triforce pretty good on you, Camille's in a sort of similar boat here. But I just kept thinking of like, but what would Riven want? Because what we observe right now is that Sterix has more pick rate than Maw and Death Dance combined, and Eclipse and Sundered Sky are basically eating all the pick rate of almost all the fighter items. Yeah, Eclipse and Sundered Sky are eating a lot of it here. And so this was trying to ensure that light fighter items were good and that the types of things that Riven would want, and I just basically said, would Riven want the stat profile? And then tried to design these items such that Riven would want the stat profile and be excited about these items. Yes, Eclipse is getting nerfed. That is a Riven nerf among many other fighters, but that is kind of the goal here. So Maw is being grown up to be a full sort of big boy item. Yes, this means it's going to be a large, fairly expensive big item. In general, from what I can tell, players seem to not be very sophisticated about this, and when they see price changes, they don't seem to care. In general, broad strokes, that seems to be true, and so there's kind of free real estate if you make a good item more expensive, making it bigger, because it doesn't really matter. Also, I can go a lot of ways with like, should Ma be cheap? Should Ma be normal? Should Ma be a normal price? Whatever. There's a lot of stuff there that I want to really dive into. Ultimately, grew Ma to be a big ticket, like primary slot item that should feel good to buy, and then said, now let's make all the outputs feel good for Riven and champions like her. So 15 ability haste, absolutely very, very good. I think the class that is most deserving of haste in almost every slot is fighters. This is a direct call we made. We know ability haste has crept over time in the game. There's a lot of it. We're trying to make sure we rein it into the right amount, but fighters are the one class above all else that deserve to have ability haste on every slot if they want it. And so saying that, hey, your core MR defensive option has haste, you're probably getting haste. And if you're not a haste want, you're probably an auto attacker, here's Wit's End, right? Like, those two versions I think are in pretty good alignment here. And so having haste back on Ma, I think a very good idea. Again, I think fighters should have haste in almost every slot. There are ways to dodge around it, but in general, an ability-based fighter should have haste in every slot. Okay, so that's happened. Cool. This is about 600 gold worth of ability haste, which is clearly a very large buff. Okay, next line. Once again, trying to have this item and Hexbreaker not checkmate the enemy champions. In a 1v1, saying, okay, well, relative to this item's power budget, the shield is going to be more of the defensive output. If you're in a giant team fight where Fiddlesticks and Syndra are hitting you all at the same time, you're going to get the full value out of the shield, no questions asked. We actually buffed the duration to really make sure that it was going to do its entire job and actually block a bunch of Crowstorm or a whole Syndra ult or whatever, just to like make sure it was going to do its job. But if you're in a 1v1, if you're like, I don't know, Annie against Zed and Zed rushes Ma, you can see Ma get popped, wait 3 seconds, right? You have ultimate control over this one. Maybe the guy runs away, whatever. Like, you can wait 3 seconds, wait out the Ma, and then keep fighting the guy. And so in a 1v1 case, this item just has 10 less MR, and you can wait out the shield, right? And so in a 1v1 case, you have this happening in all cases. You have this, which you can counterplay, and then it's like, okay, yeah, more expensive, more haste, more attack damage, sure. In a lot of cases, I think this can be fairly neutral. Again, the goal is to buff this item. It's not meant to be actually weaker than 1-1, but just to make sure it doesn't really checkmate the 1-1, right? Anyway. Plus offense, good shield and 40 MR is still plenty of defense per slot here. I think it's more than enough. I think it's plenty. Keep in mind, again, if you're Riven, you get ability haste and more AD to make your E shield more plentiful and stronger. So, I think this reinforces pretty well. Lifeline duration to 3 seconds. Just ultimately, this is matching the other lifeline shields. Sterix is longer, but it decays, but this matches Seraph's and this matches Shield Bow, which I think is reasonable. So, to sort of free room to buff here. And I'm a fan of consistency in places where it makes the learning experience that little bit nicer. So a shield you don't have control over the timing of, I think it's to be a longer duration shield than a shield you have control over the timing of, right? I think this should be longer than Barrier or longer than like a Lulu E or something. I think that reasonably makes sense. And in some cases you want to break the mold because like you actually want the buff of Janet E to matter. In the case of Lulu, the Lulu E like damage amp is not even tied to the shield duration. They're not even like remotely conjoined. In the Janna case, of course, it is. So that one's unique, right? But there's a good reason why. There's a reason to break consistency. Anyway, you don't have control of the shield duration, so make it a little bit generous to ensure that it maybe does its actual job. And then this is the biggest buff of the entire thing, which is converting from Lifesteal to Omnivamp. Even if you're like the most hardcore auto attacker, you're going to get value out of the Omnivamp even on top of this one. So this is a really, really big deal, right? This is the primary buff of the item, of the patch, I would even say. This is a huge deal. I think Ma is going to be exceptionally strong because 10% Omnivamp, and by the way, to be clear, this lifeline, this like Omnivamp buff lasts until your champion leaves combat, which means once it pops, the shield might decay, but you get 10% Omnivamp for the rest of the fight. Which is a very, very big deal. This Omnivamp matches what Riftmaker gives, and that doesn't seem to break the game entirely, so yeah, very big deal here. Death's Dance is the second buff here in this case, and it's saying, hey, it's a pretty simple change. It is a build path being upgraded to include pickaxe, so it's just nicer to buy. If you buy this 1 second slot, you're very likely to have room for the pickaxe in your build, so just some niceness there if you don't have the last 125 to finish the item, or if you want this over Warhammer for some reason, or if you want it over Steel Sigil for some reason, you can. Okay, fine. Plus 5 AD, of course, a strict buff, 175 gold worth of stats, and 50% stronger healing on Defy. I'm not sure this is going to be quite enough. I'm inclined to maybe buff the bleed out duration and such, makes the item a little bit nicer if this item needs even more. But this is obviously a somewhat small buff. I am a little wary of how strong this is allowed to be long term. But for now, we're giving it to the light fighters to say, look, if you just want a really, really big AD stat stick, if you want to convert AD into healing post combat, if you're getting kills fast enough, your combat's short enough that the bleed out cleanse is actually good, then here's a thing that you should hopefully feel good about. I think, generally speaking, should be in a pretty good state. So, yeah, buff that stance, who, I think honestly needs it. And then that's being countered by a nerfs to Sterix Gauge. I think this item is still very good, to be clear. 200 gold is not a huge nerf. 30-second cooldown on Lifeline is not a very big deal either. There's going to be a lot of cases where this Lifeline cooldown is just not going to matter, and it's going to be up for all the team fights that matter anyway, which means really the nerf in a lot of cases is 200 gold, which for the best defensive fighter item by a ton, 200 gold is not a huge nerf, but it's a small nerf and a small nerf, and that adds up to this hopefully being reasonable. I just think 6-second cooldown is very expectation breaking. This once again matches the Lifeline cooldown to the other Lifeline items. This is a space where I do think consistency matters. Ma being magic damage only, Sterix decaying, all those other rules I think are fine to be unique across things, right? Shield Bow doesn't scale off of any stats. Ma does. Sterix scales off different stats. Like, those are all things where it's like, yeah, they all have different rules per shield, but their cooldown cadences, their like rough duration scaling, like all those I think are worth moving closer together, so that kind of situation is just more learnable. Yes, you can read tooltips, all these things are possible, but I think an improvement to increase consistency in these areas, especially when we're already trying to nerf and buff these items in respective ways. Now we're going to the first thing that actually has math on it. Sundered Sky is a little bit overperformant. It is basically crushing fighter item choice overall. 2-second cooldown on Light Shield Strike basically is not going to be a huge deal, but I just think this ability is a little bit too repeatable, especially for something that is honestly quite invisible for your opponents to play around. Obviously, it's pretty satisfying to play as when you're the fighter to go see your markers up and go hit somebody and do all that stuff, and that's fine. This is still a short enough cooldown where it is clearly a repeatable action, but again, Sundered Sky, OP. And the thing is, because Sundered Sky is a guaranteed crit, there aren't good ways of lowering the damage on this item. We could lower the AD further down to like 40. That feels a little bit rough. 40 AD on items starts to feel almost like a meme for a 3,000 gold something item, but that would be a possibility for lowering the damage of the item. But because it's tied to you critting, there's not a lot of ways to lower the proc damage. And so, generally speaking, trying to, first things first, lower burst damage on fighters a bit by giving them care more about your stats, more about your haste, more about your other stuff here, but trying to lower burst damage, but again, we don't have it as an individual per hit lever, so cooldown is our best way of going about damage here. Second thing was we didn't think this was going to be enough of a nerf, so went after some amount of the healing, took 20% base AD ratio off the heal. This is basically roughly 20 flat off the heal. We do have some math. Flashbang warning. And so you can see, about 20 base off the heal here is, a decent portion. If you're full HP, keep in mind Sundered Sky does overheal you and gives you more max HP or a shield, I forget which, if you're already full health when you go for the trade, but hey, 20 less here. If you were very, very, very low and you're at 1 HP, looking at sort of relatively normal fighter builds, the heal is cut by about half as much. About half as much power comes from the missing health heal as the base AD heal if you're low on HP. Obviously, if you're full health, most of it's just base AD. On to Eclipse. Eclipse, again, somewhat crushing fighter itemization choice here. It's just doing a bit too well. And ultimately caring once again about fighter proc damage. We were actually willing to do this nerf back in 14.3. I think we took a bunch of other proc items down. Eclipse was on the short list, but its pick rate was so low that we said we're going to wait until players realize that Eclipse is actually OP, because it's going to feel weird nerfing something that players don't think is good, and we know this item is good. We don't want to like nerf the proc and then compensate it because the item's already very, very good overall. So we're just going to wait and let players figure it out, and then we're going to do it. And so players have figured it out. Eclipse is the most picked first item slot fighter item in the game now. It wasn't back when this launched. So taking down melee proc burst, we are not nerfing range burst here. It's not really needed. It's still a nice cheap price point. It's still got really good stats here, but yeah, your short-term trade's going to do less damage. We move on to champion changes here. So this is basically the set of changes where the adjustments were large enough to be sort of front and center towards the top of the list. Akshan has a fairly high ban rate and high elo for his pick rate. Whatever, that's not necessarily a problem, but he's extremely, extremely high elo performant as a super duper lane bully, and his late game really sucks, which often means that he's going to suck in low MR. Like, not only is Akshan fairly hard to play, but he is extremely early game skewed. Now, I don't think this champ should be late game skewed. I don't think this champ should be like Kale, where he's got a bad laning phase and he's a late game marksman who wins the game, but flattening him out some to have like a small amount of early game skew instead of a like large amount, I think is pretty much free real estate. I think this champion could have a, like 1 to 2% win rate decay from early game to late game. That would be more than reasonable. And maybe he could even go flat. I'm not sure. But sort of experientially, that's sort of directionally, I think, what's good for the champion, slightly better for the champion. This actually allows us to bridge some MMR skew. And it's actually part of the reason why Akshan is often allowed to be kind of overpowered, is we get this weird state where um, players overall are pretty hypersensitive to the balanced state of high MMR, because the vast majority of influencers are high MMR. And pretty much every scene, every League of Legends scene, NA, EU, Korea, China, whatever, is pretty influencer driven. And so it's like, I would expect that most players would hold the opinion that Akshan is overpowered, despite the fact that his win rate in like sub Emerald is below 50%, and like 72% of players are sub Emerald. Now, again, 50% win rate is not balanced. This champion's relatively hard to play, and so much in the same way that Zed is sub 50 but still quite good, Akshan can be sub 50 and still quite good. That could be fine. That's not necessarily a problem. But I just don't believe this champion's actually overpowered for like half of all players when his late game doesn't exist, and the average gold game goes like 29 minutes, right? Whereas the average Masters game goes like 24, which means that Akshan, who falls off a cliff in the mid and late game, doesn't have to run into that in the average Masters game. And hey, look, win rate skew beyond just mastery curves. That's a pretty big deal, right? So again, I think flattening out his win rate curve, because I think it is reasonable for this champion to have a flatter win rate curve, is a nice way to make this champion more performant in the MR brackets where he's already not performant, while still preserving mastery skew and all these things that are fair for this champion. He's, nothing about this champion screams easy to play, and that's fine. Either way, we are taking down some of his high frustration spacing tools and higher frustration roaming tools, and playing up late game reliability. So to be clear, we are actually nerfing his early game and buffing his late game, and we are in fact buffing things that are easier to use and nerfing things that are a bit harder to use. So we are making this champion a little bit easier to play by bringing up the floor and bringing down the ceiling, as well as moving mastery skew around. I would not be surprised if this champion gained win rate in lower MMRs. I would be very surprised if this champion gained win rate in higher MMRs. Ultimately, the goal is still to overall nerf Akshan. I think that's just the correct choice here. And so anyway, move speed on Hitting Champ with Q. I believe this is a decaying. Hold on, no. This one's flat. It's the pass that's decaying. I'm pretty sure. Regardless, the move speed on champ hit on Q is going down from 20 to 40 by rank, and the vast majority of high MMR Akshan's max Q first is getting flattened to 20%, so it is a lot less kiting. Yeah. The second thing is the damage on non-champions, both minions and monsters, is also being dropped to only 80% total damage. Now keep in mind, compared to someone like Sivir, Sivir has a fall off per minion hit. Akshan actually guarantees hits the wave because it continues to bounce further as it hits minions, so it's actually very, very easy to Akshan hit the entire wave. It's actually trivial to do so, and so the more that Akshan's wave clear can be a little bit weaker, the less he roams, a little bit harder is to last hit, whatever. Ultimately, just these are ways to nerf his landing phase, right? And then there's a compensation buff to damage on R. Now, you might notice here that we're going from dealing 4x damage at max at minimum HP to only doing 3x damage at minimum HP. Now, keep in mind, the base damage is basically always higher, the AD ratio always higher, and especially on a high HP target. Now, Comeuppance has a lot of counterplay built into the skill. Not only can you block it in the same way that you can block a Caitlyn ulti, but also you can have minions block it. You can have turrets block it. This spell is really, really bad against players who know what they're doing, which makes the spell really, really kind of suck in higher MMR play. It also just doesn't really scale all that well. Now, some of this is kind of fake, the damage per bullet, because the number of bullets actually increases per rank, and so seeing this go from 25 to 45 is kind of fake data, because this goes from functionally 75 to, 5 to 7, so it goes from like 120 something to, closer to 300. Regardless, let's do the math here. Let's go. We'll talk about it more later. So here is the Akshan Q minion damage before and after. At rank 9, you get the maximum percentage difference, which is about 10-ish% less damage, and it's on forever. You get to the point where, yeah, you're still going to one-shot cast minions once you come into late game, but hey, it's going to be a little bit harder to kill melee. Maybe it takes you 2 Qs. Maybe it's going to take you an extra auto to kill minions at some various breakpoints. Okay, fine, whatever. Kiting boost speed, choosing to give him a random point where, like, here's where, like, Boots 2 comes in, here's where Boots 3 comes in, roughly. Yeah, he's slower, right? When he lands Q on champions, he's slower, he's going to have less kiting tools, he's going to have worse wave clear. Those are the nerf direction, right? Okay, let's talk about R. Now, this, to be fair, R applies Akshan's passive. So this data table is assuming you're hitting a, like, full HP target with no unblocking shots, with, like, they're shielded or something, so they never drop below max HP. That's obviously kind of fraudulent, but we're also assuming they're going to take all 5 shots, and then at rank 2, they start taking 6 shots, which means 2 passive triggers, and then at rank 3, they take 3 passive shots, 7 shots, which is still 2 passive triggers. And so rolling the passive as well, you get this much of a damage increase, which is about 25%. Okay, fine. In a world where you only hit 2 of the bullets because someone blocked part of the shots or they're dancing around or whatever, this actually goes up because the passive was not buffed here, but the damage per bullet was buffed here. And so that's why it says 50% damage increase, because ultimately when you look at this, you say, oh, 30 becomes 45, 10% becomes 15%, right? The maximum damage increase is theoretically 50% in a world where you get to rank 3 ulti and all this stuff. But you can see that the damage is a little bit late game skewed, especially if you discount passive damage, because the damage per rank went up a lot, and the gold scaling went up a lot. Okay, great. Now if someone's at very low health, or at 10% HP left over, again the passive is still there, but the damage is indeed still higher in all cases. Keep in mind the passive is entirely flat in this case, and so anything that is green is actually more green in the real world. But in a world where the actual ulti damage is doing more of the heavy lifting, and not the passive, aka they're low on health. Even though we've nerfed somewhat of the low health stuff here, you can see again a late game skewed buff to the ultimate. So yeah, pretty meaningful buff to the ultimate overall. And this now puts it into the realm of, yeah, like he landed a full channel on you, no one blocked the shots. Yes, the ulti now does like 2,000 damage before mitigation. On low health targets, it's going to be much better execute. And if they're already kind of higher on health, it's going to be better at getting them low. And one thing I will point out as well is that this skill double dips on itself, right? The more damage per bullet you have, the lower health they go, meaning that further bullets will do even more damage than before. And so in a case you're hitting like a half HP, 80% health target or whatever, and the tooltip DPS is, oh, I do 20% more damage, it's going to be 25 to 30% more damage because they're getting lower per chunk to bullet, which means more damage in the bullets afterwards. And so a pretty meaningful bump in terms of how much damage coming out of the R. Bel'Veth is getting a slew of nerfs that I hope to be high MR skewed. So one thing that's interesting is the vast majority of SRT is incredibly high MR. I think every decision maker and implementer on LivePod is at least masters right now in solo queue. And that's cool because it means we know the game really well, but the difficulty with that is we don't have good perspectives on what like silver League of Legends feels like. And to be clear, silver players matter a whole hell of a lot. And so we have to source opinions from outside of literally ourselves to get opinions on what lower MR games feel like. Like we can look at win rates, that's fine, but experientially, it's hard to know. Obviously, all of Reddit is Challenger, right? We can't get silver input here in any reliable way. We have to go ask, I don't know, LEC players, I guess. So what this means is there's two things going on with Bel'Veth. So number one, we are nerfing Bel'Veth primarily for a relatively high MR solo queue. She is incredibly performant. She's one of the harder to play champions, so we would expect to see some elite skew, some high MR skew because of mastery curves, but also this champion is incredibly performant in high MR play. She's too good, so we want to nerf her. And so we're nerfing her by nerfing her Q damage and by nerfing the amount of attack speed from her passive. Okay, great. Now the feedback we got though, when we went after like nerfing the Q was one of the designers who's I forget how good he actually is. I don't know if he's like silver or gold or what, but like anyway, he's not masters. Was like, hey, my experience with Bel'Veth is that her early clear feels really dicey and really unsafe, and I am always nervous anytime I play this champion because she's like kind of frail and the execution requirement is kind of high. I'm like, oh, cool. This is useful feedback because like I have never felt that as someone who's like moderately good at optimizing jungle clears. And so this drove this change here, which two things going on. So one, I think directionally doing flat mods on jungle mods is much better than percent mods on jungle damage. Generally speaking, the reason is that we want to make sure your first clears are comfortable. Generally, they don't have to be really fast, but they should be comfortable. And so ways of like giving you healing or flat damage or whatever to like make your clears fairly safe and reliable and whatever. Not that you can't be invaded, but just some amount of reliability is valuable. But then oftentimes if your mod is percent based and you're a carry champion, you start just one-shotting jungle camps. And that is one thing I think actually really exacerbates a like fighter versus tank performance in high MR. Is like when you look at high MR Graves in solo queue, people are bad at tracking and they just start eviscerating camps, and like having high map uptime is a really big deal for solo queue high MR Graves. When you look at pro play, that's not what jungle's about, right? It's not about how fast can you clear and be on the map. they're just lower econ in general. And despite the fact that we see Sejuani and Maokai and other champs be really performant and really strong in pro play, they're actually not performant in solo queue. And that is, I think, one of the factors. And so ways where we can say, look, you're a high damage champion, you're Bel'Veth, you're clearly going to frag. But hey, in the late game, you're going to one-shot camps a little bit less hard is, again, I think directionally good for League of Legends, the game. They're still going to be better at it because she gets a bunch of AD and attack speed, but just less one-shotting of camps, right? I think directionally good for the game. So this is a buff and nerf together. This is a buff to the early clearing speed by just basically to make the early clears a little bit nicer, a little bit easier, a little bit less stressful, but it's going to be a nerf to the late game clearing speed. Now, of course, an early game clear speed buff will tend to be elite skewed, of course, but the fact that he's going to be doing less damage so that you don't like one camp invade or three camp invade, those invades going to be less strong, and so, you know, hopefully it averages out with, again, this hoping to be a nerf. So let's talk about Bel'Veth numbers. So this is data tab on the left. Basically, we're assuming her most common 4-item build, which has 3 attack speed items on it. Kraken, Stride, Wits End, I believe, with Legend Alacrity. And this is doing pretty well, where you go from 0 to 150 stacks, and this is doing where you're doing very poorly, 0 to 75 stacks. And so you can see total attacks per second before and after. Now keep in mind, bonus attack speed is a factor in how many shots come out of her E, and so you're going to have an impact there as well. This is not just auto attack DPS, but E DPS as well. So here's the math on this. Okay, great. Here is the PvP and functionally minion damage on the Q. Actually a pretty meaningful hit. Despite the fact it doesn't build a ton of bonus attack damage, it's still 8% less damage on a, you know, resetting decent AoE damage tool. So not only do you have less attack speed, thus, you know, less auto attack DPS, thus less E damage, but also less Q damage. And so Bel'Veth is going to be just less lethal as a champion. But again, throughout the early to mid game, this is around 1 item and a component. Around here is the break even, where you're going to start having, you know, slower clears for a 18th portion of the game. You know, this is like 14 minutes plus, around, maybe a little bit sooner than that. But regardless, kind of in that boat of like, yeah, your early clears a little bit nicer, but again, not by a ton, right? It's like 7 damage per spell. It's not a huge amount, but it's something. You know, first camp, it's 5 damage per spell, right? It's like 20 total damage on casting 4 Qs. So you're not a huge difference, but it matters, and you're going to lose actually more than that in PvP. Okay, Bel'Veth changes. Move on to Kennen. Added an indicator, so if you hover over his E, you can now see the radius at which your E will deal damage, in case you want to know that. You can learn it if you're like a newer Kennen player. New animation on the R, and now he is able to move while doing the quarter-second cast time of channeling up the R. I think it's worth still having the quarter-second ceremony. He yells, there's an animation, you can tell what's going on. Oh, okay, Maelstrom is starting, let's get ready. I think that is worth having, that is useful to have. We want to have that there. So we still want the quarter-second cast time, but we don't want a lot to stop in place because that creates anti-synergy between his E, which gives move speed, and his R, which puts it at 0. Obviously, it's going to be a buff. Kennen will be quite a bit stronger as a champion. Neela is getting reshaped away from burst damage on Q to attack damage speed, attack speed after landing the Q. So burst damage down, attack speed up, we think is the correct way to directionally reshape Neela. To be clear, we intend to nerf this champion. This champion is incredibly overperformant, and so we're nerfing her. So this is the expecting her to get 80% crit chance and, you know, 4 crit items in current League of Legends. Here is the damage per Q spell. It is, of course, quite a bit of damage down. By mid-game, it's 10% less damage on your bread and butter active spell. That said, gaining attack speed back on the Q attack speed should be, you know, meaningful in trading some of it back. But yeah, the goal here, to be clear, is a meaningful nerf to Neela. Sejuani is getting significant gold scaling buffs. The bonus armor MR in the past is going 50% to 75%. Her health scaling on the W is going up from a combined 8% to a combined 12%, with a base damage nerf to keep it relatively neutral on incredibly low econ gameplay. So let's talk about Sejuani. Here is the total value of the passive, averaging the armor and MR together. Looking at her most common default builds, it is giving her more armor and MR. This is not a ton, but it is always on for the start of every fight, and it lingers for, I believe, 3 seconds. This is doing the math in terms of what is her total armor MR before and after as a result, and thus her essentially percent HP during this while it's happening. This is not necessarily the damage reduction, but the like effective health of Sejuani before and after. It's not a huge deal, but hey, being 7% more durable for 3 seconds is something. It is power. It is some win rate. We haven't updated tank tools a lot on tanks, so it's hard for me to know exactly how potent this lever is, but it's certainly a lever all the same. Second, we're moving damage around on Sejuani. Oh, this is actually W1 and W2. We'll do that real quick, but There's not a good reason why I chose to move the damage into W1 away from W2. I just liked that W2 did roughly twice as much damage as W1, and so I picked those as numbers. Again, not a really big reason why, I just thought it was neat and convenient, and it allowed for very clean numbers here. You could have it do triple, right? This could have been 3 and 9, and then just like found flat damage numbers that, you know, reasonably worked here. But I chose double because I wanted to. Just because. It doesn't really matter. Like, there wasn't really a rhyme or reason why W1 should be buffed and W2 should be nerfed, but whatever. The important thing that matters here is the full damage of W itself. Now, I took her default solo Q build, which ends up having a decent amount of bonus HP on it. You run Overgrowth, of course. You run double scaling health shards. And you're going to run a lot of bonus health on items, of course. And so, yeah, Sejuani's going to have much better gold scaling via her passive and much better gold scaling via this. Now, if you aren't getting enough gold, as you can see from these like level 5, 7, and 9 breakpoints, you aren't always going to be doing as much damage. So if your build is, I don't know, Knight's Vow Frozen Heart, you're going to be doing less damage on Sejuani than before. So, hey, be warned. She has aggressive health scaling on W and aggressive armor MR scaling on passive. And so, you know, figure out which stats you want more. But hey, health gives you damage, armor MR gives you more armor MR. Have fun with that one. But again, clearly more durable, and in any realistic scenario where she's playing solo queue, more damage as well. Buffs to Sejuani. Skarner is extremely, extremely, extremely overpowered right now. More powerful than we wanted him to be, and so of course we have to nerf this champion. We actually micropatch and nerfed him within 2 days of the last patch dropping, but of course we have to go harder here as well. It's worth noting that Skarner's pick rate times win rate is, I forget it was 0.2 or 0.6, I think it's 0.2, deflating every other jungler's win rate by 0.2%. So if a champion is like 50.8, actually 51, but Skarner's pick rate times win rate is deflating it by a quarter of 1%. By comparison, Skarner was inflating every champ's win rate by about 0.8% the patch before, because everyone was bad at him. So yeah, there was a lot to claw back. We need to take around 4% win rate off of jungle Skarner, and about 2% win rate off of top lane Skarner at current tuning right now. And support Skarner is fine. He's not really the primary role. Secondary role, if he falls off and is bad, that's not really worth salvaging right now. It's like 10% of the total champion's play rate, but, you know, aware that some players are playing support Skarner. We don't have a problem with it, but it's going to be really hard to maintain 3 roles. But clearly, the lion's share of Skarner players are in top and jungle, and so we're very happy to ensure that both top and jungle are viable and fun and good. Okay, Skarner is also very elite skewed, and he's very early game skewed. So a little bit like with Akshan, we expected some elite skew in this champion, but I don't think this champion needs to specifically be early game skewed. I don't mind if it's flat, I don't mind if it's late game, I don't mind whatever, but expect some level of elite skew, that's fine. Okay, so mana regen growth just is a very generic top lane laning buff. It's also, by being a growth stat, is a low MMR buff. To some degree in jungle, to more in top lane. This line will buff top more, that's going to nerf buff jungle, and it's going to buff low MR more, it's going to buff high MR. Okay, great. Directionally, all those things are good because we have more room in top than we have in jungle. Next up, reverting the prior nerf to Q. So what's nice is the last few changes that we made to Q and W managed to flatten out Q max versus W max in top lane. That's a good thing because the gameplay of W max in top lane is pretty poor. If you 50% win rate because he's just pressing W on cooldown, that's honestly pretty bad gameplay, and so we do want to do enough to make sure that this is not just like making for a bad gameplay experience, not just being overpowered. Alright, so we are both nerfing the rank up on W via the slow and the rank up on Q via the damage. Ultimately, right now, Q is dealing too much damage as a level 9 power spike, and so trying to bring the level 9 power spike. There are more things we could do to bring this down as well. We could make, for example, the rock throw damage scale on champ level and have the break even be like level 11 or 12 or something, so that, again, he has to wait longer to get a lot of rock throw damage, and you know, we can pay it out later and find numbers that make sense where the rock throw is still impactful. It's very important that upheaval feels good and feels chunky, but yeah, the champion spikes you out at level 9. Also, there is so yeah, basically there's a optimization that we don't think is required here. So Skarner right now is getting the best of both worlds on Q, where he resets his duration on Q when he hits something, but it doesn't consume the stack when he hits something that he doesn't deal damage to, aka wards and plants. So the change here is that it still doesn't consume the stack on wards and plants, but it doesn't refresh the duration either. I thought that was the better version than consume the stack and deal very little. I could be convinced otherwise, absolutely, but what I'm choosing here is that you don't consume a stack, but you don't refresh the duration. So the optimization of pressing your Q like 10 seconds early, then hitting the blast cone, and then starting your blue buff, and then getting your second Q instantly when your first Q is done. That optimization is going away. You have to do it 4 seconds early now instead of 9 seconds early. Deal with it. Again, the power spike damage going down by 20 per hit, which to be clear is 60 damage off the spell, which is a pretty big deal. Again, the rank up nerf on the W, and then just a more generic nerf. Skarner is... We actually expect Skarner to be one of the higher damage tanks in the game, which means if he's going to preserve some level high damage, which it should maybe still go down to be clear, he can be a little bit less durable. His E is, of course, very good at escaping, and so we're taking some durability down because he can stomach this as a reasonable nerf, but we may take damage down in the future and leave his durability where it is, depending on how these changes all land. Okay, let's start doing some math. So the total damage of Q, assuming you are landing all 3 hits and the rock throw, what is the total bonus damage that Q gives you? It is, of course, quite a lot. The button is worth 130 damage at level 1. The button is worth about 440 damage at level 9. That is quite good for the first max ability. Keep in mind this ability requires you to auto-attack 3 times, or auto-attack twice and then land a skill shot. So this is not the same thing as like landing a Syndra Q by any means, but obviously this is quite a lot of damage per spell cast, per button press. Yes, there are hoops to jump through, but this is, of course, quite a lot of damage, and so, yeah, it goes down. Not much to say here, other than there's still a lot of damage in this button. It's important that Q carries a lot of the damage on Skarner, because it is clearly his heaviest, slowest, air quotes, clunkiest ability, and so it is very, very important that this is, like, very, very heavy and very, very big. But yeah, it's doing a lot of damage. That damage is going down. Okay. The slow on W, of course, getting nerfed as soon as you are level 8, which is pretty early on. My rule of thumb is that second maxes tend to not be terribly skewed, whereas first maxes tend to be high MR skewed because you hit this pretty early, and last maxes tend to be low MR skewed. Second maxes tend to be relatively flat from what I've noticed here. But it's going to mean that Skarner is less disruptive. Now, he still has the Q slow. He still has a 6-second cooldown, 20% slow, which is not bad by any means, but he's going to be less disruptive overall in the fight. I do like Skarner being disruptive. I think it is important. That said, we are pretty low on levers left on ways to nerf WMAX, and so this is one of the ones we have left. All we've got now is base damage going up by, I believe it's 20, and the cooldown going down by 1. Which, yeah, not a lot left there to nerf. Of course, we wanted to make this cooldown like 9 to 7 or something to further nerf WMAX. We could, but for now, I'm pretty happy with where he's at, and so these are the numbers. Again, hoping to do this appropriately. A project on champion radii. I ended up noticing that we had champs in weird states where I don't even remember where I found it. Oh yeah, no, I remember looking at it because I was looking at Skarner. We were looking at hitboxes. No, we were looking at model sizes because player feedback was that Battlecast Alpha Skarner was too large, and so I started digging into what makes things big and small. Ultimately, someone else submitted the change. One of our artists submitted the change on resizing it's internally called a skin scale on Battlecast Alpha Skarner, and was like, yep, okay, we like this number, that's cool, okay, great. And then I went in and then checked, like, okay, what is the gameplay impact of that? And the answer is nothing. All the gameplay impacting stuff, such as how basically this stuff is completely irrespective of skin scale. I can make your model incredibly tiny, and it will not affect in any way how hard you hit skill shots, how you path around minions, all these things. They're truly irrelevant. But I had to learn that, right? I didn't know the system very well. I happened across Garen, and I was like, wait a second, Garen's click box is really small. If I didn't pick Garen, if I clicked like Leona or something, actually no, Leona's also this. If I had picked Pyke, I would have probably not have noticed that this project was worth doing, because I just wouldn't have known to look. But I'm like, wait a second, this looks like a really small selection radius for Garen. And I investigated and was like, oh, wait a second. Yeah, Garen has a very small selection radius. Hey, what are these pathfinding radii? What are these gameplay collision radii? I'm like, wait a second. And then I was able to find, thanks to the League Wiki, it wasn't a perfectly up-to-date data set, but it was mostly correct for like 90% of cases. Oh, there's actually a bunch of champions with really strange selection criteria and collision boxes and pathfinding radii. And so did a big pass, like basically asked people a bunch of questions like, hey, how do you feel about this? Should we do it? What's valuable here? There's more work that could be done specifically on pathfinding radius. There are some very odd pathfinding outliers that for now have been left alone. But we might want to do a pass on at some point when we're confident that directionally it's correct for the game. But for now, basically just said, okay, gameplay collision radius, which is how easy you are to auto attack and how easy you are to hit with skill shots, those should change to be consistent. And then selection radius, which is how easy you are to literally left click on when I'm trying to like target you with a Veigar R. Not the range of Veigar R, but that I can literally click on you and the game client says, you cast Veigar R on this champion. Retune those to all be reasonable. And so basically what it comes down to is 140 is large, 120 is human, and 100 is Yordle or Child, basically. Now, there are a few exceptions. Aurelion Sol is really, 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 really big. So he is uniquely bigger than everyone else at 150. I think that's fine. Bard is really big, but not completely monstrous. So he's between human and, you know, really big creature like Blitzcrank. This was ad hoc. I chose his number and no one told me no. I don't know what to tell you. Brahm's also here, right? I just like decided we have a number for really big humanoid. That's not like actually Cho'Gath or Zac or whatever. Darius, I shrunk to humanoid. Diana, right, grew to humanoid. Gangplank grew to humanoid, right? Like all these things. Gragas, you know, very large person, regular human. So basically, these all just say like, hey, it's going to be much easier to target Jace with spells and target Garen with spells and target Gangplank with spells and target Diana with spells, and it's going to be a lot easier to target Brand because his selection radius is really, really, really small, which is kind of weird. And Aurelion Sol was a little bit too easy to click, and Alistair was too easy to click, and there's some cases where it was really odd as well. Zoe is actually I mean, she's canonically thousands of years old, but looks like a child, and so gets smaller. Zac is huge, and why is he 90, right? Like all these random things, right? You know, Yuumi ended up inheriting, you know, random human-sized champion, which is, you know, silly, and so, you know, bring that down. Similar for collision radius. Actually grew Aurelion Sol up to 80. Actually left his pathfinding radius small. So this is medium. I guess this is human. This is Garen and Riven and Fiora. I generally speaking tried to not change pathfinder radius unless it was like really clearly correct for the champion. And so Aurelion Sol I left at 35, but I made his skill shot size 80. The fact that he's floating makes it weird. The fact that he has a big ethereal tail makes it weird. Aurelion Sol might have to be larger than this in actual gameplay terms for what makes him what makes the game make sense. But also Aurelion Sol floats in a straight line, is very easy to land. At least in my MR, I've never seen someone miss a skill shot on me when I'm flying in a straightforward line. This is not meant to be like, here's our sick, cute Aurelion Sol nerf. It's meant to be like, why the hell did Mystic Shot miss? Like, that's the goal here, is that should not be weird, as opposed to, this doesn't make sense. So Briar being grown to normal human size, Darius being shrunk to normal human size. Again, this does affect auto attack radius. Is going to affect, you know, this is going to be 15 less auto attack range for Darius. I don't expect this to matter. If it does, we can always try to find ways to compensate. Cassante is being grown to a large champion with a gameplay radius to match, pathing radius to match. Lulu being shrunk to Yordle, Melia being shrunk to Child, Naafiri being grown to medium size, Vex being shrunk to Yordle, Warwick being grown to medium size, Yuumi being shrunk to Yordle, Zoe being shrunk to Child. And again, in most of these cases, it's like, well, if you're being shrunk to Child, you're going to be Child. If you're going to be grown to large, again, I kept Aurelion Sol as an exception, as I don't think Aurelion Sol, like, I don't know, meets the bulkiness standard in my mind. Like, the fact that he literally flies means I would actually expect him to have a very lithe pathfinding radius, because, again, the goal here is not like specifically gameplay consistency necessarily. The goal here is artistic art lines up with gameplay results here. And so Aurelion Sol is freaking huge, and so skill shot should hit him. But Aurelion Sol is flying. I don't expect him to be hit by like blocked by minions very much, right? And so yes, he's inconsistent on purpose. Congratulations. Again, purposeful choices here, right? Consistency is worth breaking when there is a good reason to break it. Okay, we move on to smaller gameplay changes that aren't meant to be huge. It's meant to be very easy to just pass through and parse. A simple nerf to Ahri, taking 5 damage off W, and nerfing rank 2 and 3 of the R cooldown. Yep, here you go. 5 damage on W. This is going you're getting all the damage on a single target. It is an early game nerf. It is less so in the late game because 5 flat damage. The nerf to R, though, is, of course, late game nerfed. Essentially, rank 1 of ulti is usually going to be happening when you're only on last chapter. This ability already felt like it had a very fair cooldown. But considering Ahri is building quite a bit of Malignance, and also, even beyond Malignance, her uptick of Ulti Hunter has shot up a ton. And ultimately, 80 seconds on an ulti cooldown for a class that already gets a lot of haste, and then especially ones that opt into buying a bunch of ulti haste or even ruining a bunch of ulti haste, it's just like is too short for ulti cooldown. I could honestly envision a world where we literally never let you change your ulti cooldown. We say every source of haste in the game only affects basic abilities ulti hunter is gone, and you just and like you can't do it to summoners either, or maybe you can like one very specific scenario or whatever, in a world where like no, we've like really heavily constrained these high budget buttons, and they're just going to be more rare. And we might like bring these cooldowns down to like they're all 120 or lower at rank 1, maybe not TF and Karthus, but like you know what I mean, right? I'm not saying this will ever happen, but it's something that I have entertained in my head, and I'm like, there's some value there of being like, no, we actually just want incredible game pacing control over ultimates. Experientially, like one of the worst feelings I have is like I did somebody's ulti, I respawn, I walk back in the map, and their ulti's already back up, and I did it again. And it's like I don't have a way of like addressing you when your ult's down, because if your ult kills me, it's just always back up in time, and I it's okay if things are frustrating and things beat you. That's totally reasonable, but some part of that feels a little bit off to me. Maybe that's incorrect though, but it's something that's in the back of my head. Well, regardless, again, this is still a more than reasonable ulti cooldown at the end of the day for a champion who's at the very least going to build, if she's not going Malignance, is going to go Ludens, and that's 25 haste right there, which is 20% off this, which means, yeah, her guaranteed rank 3 ulti cooldown is 80 anyway on non-ulti haste builds without any other investment here. So ultimately just think that this spell gets too short, and so here we are. Next change are some simple buffs to Amumu. This champion is one of the easiest to play champs in League of Legends. He is honestly like a pretty welcoming beginner champion, and so while our primary customer for Summoners Rift team live is skewing high MMR ranked play, Summoners Rift is in fact a game mode that lots of new players play and is also a meaningful customer for us. Now, this is probably going to be a short list of champions that long term are going to like manicure and make sure are really good for brand new League of Legends players, because that is important. But it might mean that like we'll do changes for that as opposed to like because of high MR solo queue. Regardless though, this is not a reshape, this is not anything here. This is Amumu is simply weak for how easy he is in low MR, when like I would never expect Silver Rengars to be remotely as performant as Silver Amumu's. It should basically never be close, and it's currently not, but again, the fact that Amumu isn't like bordering on like 54% win rate in Silver means he's probably just actually weak. Now, I'm a big fan of any time I see these happen, buffing early clears in safe, reliable ways, because like if you really are playing this champion because you're a brand new player or like a relatively new player and you're unsophisticated at jungle optimizations, it's like, oh, well, I can give you level 1 armor, I can give you level 1 health, I can give you level 1 AD, I can give you level 1 attack speed, I can give you level 1 ability damage. I can basically make your clear comfier, safer, sometimes faster, not always. In this case, we're not really making it faster, not in high elo anyway. But it also ends up, because early game tends to be high elo skewed, this does actually bring up his win rate in higher MRs. Now, Amumu has a ton of room in high MR solo queue. This champion is nowhere close to breaking any kind of win rate goals other than being arguably just too weak as a champion. So to me, it's like free real estate where we can bring him up in his most underperforming sector while also giving him a lot of comfiness in a sector where he's meant to look very strong because he's easy. And so to me, that's like a really, really clean thing to do. I was willing to go for +7 AD and put him at 60, which would still be kind of low for a tank. But giving him decent armor, giving him decent base attack damage, and saying go for it here. So, of course, his clear is faster. He's tankier. Some very quick math here. Yeah, he's going to deal, 7% more auto attack damage in the early game. He's going to, survive about 2% more physical damage over the course of time if he doesn't build any armor. Of course, he will long term, but whatever. Mumu changes. Aurelion Sol, of course, he's getting his hitbox size changed. Okay, great, whatever. Aurelion Sol is certainly overpowered now. It's really interesting how much impact the agency changes from like 0.3 did for this champion. It just completely supercharged his play rate, which is great to see because we can balance him around him being a real champion instead of a negative agency win rate monster. I'm really happy that we are able to tune this champion around a close to 50% win rate. I actually went back and looked at old ASOL data. So Aurelion Sol's play rate right now is, I think, more than double, and in some cases like 8 times pick a random patch old Aurelion Sol's pick rate. And by the way, in those cases, like Aurelion Sol's like Masters Plus win rate back 3 years ago was like 54%. And he had like, I don't know, like 1.5% play rate. And it was like, wow, this champ is Thanos, and he's got like no play rate at all. Aurelion Sol's win rate now in Masters Plus is like 50, and his play rate's like 4 or 5% or something. I forget what it is exactly, but it's like meaningfully higher. There were many patches where Aurelion Sol's pick rate in like sub diamond was under 1%. It was like, and this is like, again, years ago when there were, fewer champions, not that many fewer, but it's like this champ was like so incredibly unpopular and so kind of low agency and so unsatisfying. So not only did the champion update do a really good job of giving him a huge player base, but then the re-update earlier this year once again supercharged his play rate to where like he's really never had a sustained play rate this high. And to be clear, like these win rates are lower than they were 8 months ago. He literally wins fewer games, but yet feels so much better to play that he's got a way higher play rate. And the fact that champion has more agency means that the bounds on acceptable high-end win rate are lower. So sure, we'll take him down. That's fine, not a problem. If at some point we have to go after his ability to stall games, that's fine. We can find solves for that. It's not a problem. But anyway, to circle back on the point, Aurelion Sol, I think, is statistically not terribly overpowered in higher MMRs, but he is fairly overpowered in low MMRs, especially now that he has some real agency to the game. So the choice here was to take a low MMR skewed nerf to Aurelion Sol. And the point here was to take away power from the E. Specifically, his champ designer has said multiple times to me, IRL, that he doesn't want E to be a lot of the power budget. He wants it to be more about the Q, about flying around, about the breath. And he's like, anytime we can nerf Singularity, he's like, I'm for it. We can totally do that. That's totally fine. And so I said, okay, cool. I'm going to take a pretty heavy swing. A 20% off the AP ratio of E is a pretty big deal here, considering you look at the base damage here. AP ratio is like most of the damage of the skill, which you're taking 20% off of most of the damage scaling of Aurelion Sol. And I also want to point one thing out. Aurelion Sol is not a late game scaler because of stack scaling. I mean, it matters. Don't get me wrong. The stack scaling truly matters. But I've run the math multiple times in Aurelion Sol queue. These stacks are a fairly small portion of his damage. It's actually the ability power ratio that is doing a lot of the late game scaling for a Sol. And so most of Q's damage is the AP ratio relative to the stack, relative to the base damage. Clearly, most of E damage is the ability power base to the base damage, because you can literally see these numbers here, and they're really extreme here. So this is proportional to E's damage, a lot here. Now, of course, the radius growing with stacks, the execution threshold growing with stacks, like those, of course, also matter. Don't get me wrong. They're really relevant, of course. But ultimately, E is kind of invisible power where people don't realize how hard this thing actually frags, but it frags kind of a lot. So this is a very meaningful portion of his damage. I think last I checked, it was around like 20% of total damage was from E. And so taking 20% of the gold scaling, of 20% of all of his damage, is a pretty meaningful damage hit. Okay. So, also, there was a bug fix in 14.7 that made his Q not sneak past minions. That was actually meaningfully win rate down. That I think players are very bad at knowing when a win rate change happens if it's based on a bug fix or something. Like, people don't tend to read bug fixes, and so he lost meaningful win rate in 14.7, and it didn't change anyone's pick or ban rate stuff really, despite his win rate meaningfully moving there. I think we should make sure that meaningfully gameplay impacting changes do show up in the sort of top half of patch notes more often. I will work on that, but regardless, that matters here. Like, he actually has lost win rate, which means relative to what you might think about this champion, he's not as good as you may think because of that bug fix. Okay, belabor the point a lot. Let's talk about it. Here is the damage of his E, down again in the late game, very meaningfully so. E is also low MMR skewed in terms of damage output. Worst players are worse at dodging out of the E, and so this is going to nerf him in low MMR more than high MMR. Okay, great. Blitzcrank is getting a nerf. I wrote about it here, but basically they're both easy to play, but also picked a lot by autofield support. So I'm not sure which way their master curve is supposed to look like, or which way their resting win rate is supposed to look, because if they're easy to play, they should have a high win rate. If they're getting played by autofields, they should have a low win rate. And so I don't know the answer here. My expectation is I think Blitzcrank is supposed to have a slightly sub 50 win rate. I believe that's actually true here. Now, I also believe that Blitzcrank is meant to be able to kill you off landing a hook. So I don't believe it can take their damage down much. Maybe the rank 6 ulti power spike a little bit, but I don't think Q can go lower. I don't think E can go much lower, if at all. So picking a durability output, Blitzcrank actually, interestingly, dies very, very little. I think this is very little win rate, but this can matter sometimes. Just trying to play on the passive, I think, has some value. And then Overdrive, just a little bit off the move speed, so that Blitzcrank has to rely a little bit more on hooks and not just running at you to knock you up. This is meant to be about 1% win rate. We'll see if we get it. If this means almost nothing, we'll have to probably go again and find a different nerf here, but small nerf. Evelynn, as I mentioned, all junglers have about a 0.2% win rate deflation based on Skarner existing. And so if you're to look at Evelyn's win rates in solo queue, they don't look extreme. They're a little bit high for a relatively hard to play assassin, but they don't look extreme. But Evelyn's being win rate deflated by Skarner existing. So yeah, the goal here is nerf Evelynn by a decent amount here. Once again, taking down some gold scaling, and here just bringing down some of the slow on W. It actually does introduce a new optimization because this slow is inherited when your target is charmed. So if you actually want to use Allure as a drag instead, you can do that, and they're actually going to move about 50% faster while you're dragging them across the map. And so there's a new slightly high skill optimization here for Evelynn. Go have fun, use it if you want. But what I identified, what I think is true here, is that the slow that high MR Evelyns are more likely to use the uncooked slow because they just say, actually, I've got kill threshold, I'm just going to lock you down. And a meaningful duration, 65% slow, is actually very, very strong and quite good at killing someone anyway. So some gold scaling down, some burst down, and a little bit less slow. Here is the math on Evelynn R damage before and after. It's down 5 to 7%. But you might see that you no longer hit a kill threshold. Maybe, you know, some low health champion, 600 HP is not enough, 517 is not enough, or something like that. So, yep, just a little bit less damage, a little bit less power on Evelynn. Janna is getting a nerf with a small compensation buff. Generally speaking, defensive enchanters can pretty easily enjoy 52 or so % win rates. There's actually a Reddit thread that I saw last night, which was saying that Sona has the second lowest ban rate in League of Legends, despite being, a very high win rate support. But Sona is so low agency that players don't tend to mind playing against her. Janna's ban rate, even still in silver, is like 3% right now. In Diamond Plus, it's like 20% or 15 or something, because the high MR roaming WMAX Janna playstyle is very good and actually doesn't feel, it actually feels very high agency, because high elo players are better at roaming and, can go print MR this way. Absolutely, sure, yes, absolutely true. And so the point here, the goal here, is to say, well, let's not have 53 WMAX Janna and 51 Emax Janna. Let's have 52 and 52. Because, and we'll see, right? Now, I want to be clear about a couple of things. WMAX Janna has been the more fun, more like player-based retaining version of Janna. So in terms of saying, hey, what kit is the most fun for this champion? It's tended to be the WMAX build. It's why this came into the first place. I did a bunch of research at the end of last year and was like, oh, her highest play rate version of Janna was the old Zephyr move speed conversion WMAX. I'm going to go bring that back and siphon power off Q because it seems like the version of Janna where Q is powerful was not retaining a player base. So, well, clearly players were enjoying Janna when it was that version. And I was like able to contrast versus win rate as well. Like it wasn't just she was more powerful. It was per power. She was just meaningfully more popular. I said, okay, we're going to bring back that version of Janna. And I wanted to like make sure not to brick this version with these changes. Like, again, the goal is to have relatively similar win rates here. Now, if 52% WMAX Janna is still too frustrating, is eating play rate, is eating ban rate, then okay, we can take another pass here. Sure, that's fine. But trying to bring up the like very low hostility version of Emax Janna, if you want to do 3.7 to Emax, you can do that. It's all fine. But just kind of splitting the difference here and saying that yay, there is currently a underpowered build, like low agency underpowered build, and there is an overpowered build that is high agency. So let's bring down the power of the overpowered high agency build, and let's bring up the power of the underpowered low agency build. We'll meet in the middle. We'll re-measure from there. Okay, let's go. We have the math. We can talk about it real quick. Janna Max, yeah, so this, to be clear, is not including the move speed bonus calculation on the W as well, but that is also a very relevant factor where Janna is indeed, there's basically a bunch of base damage on both these that I'm not counting, so this percentage is a little fake. The flat damage difference is not fake, but hey, by the way, the math is real in terms of like, yes, it's -2, yes, it's -20, yes, it's -27, okay? That part's still real. And so you're seeing, again, you can kind of squint around these numbers a little bit here. If you wanted to, I don't care. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, this is still the damage cut here, and it's meaningful, right? It's a meaningful amount of damage cut, and then there's like a little bit more shielding, right? 020 more shielding. Again, if you're doing 5 points W into maxing E, it's going to take you a long time. Level 13 is really late for your average enchanter. If you're going to play 2 points W, 3 points W into max E, you can get it pretty much sooner, but if you are doing that, you're doing 2 points W, 3 points W, you're still getting -5, -10 damage before you're getting the follow through on your E at level 5 or level 7 or 8 or whatever, right? So anyway, win rate down for WMAX Janna, win rate up for Emax first Janna. Okay, Move on to Jinx. Now, Jinx, I actually believe, is one of these champions that can have a win rate above 50%. What's interesting is her win rate right now is not far apart from her win rate before we buffed IE. It's just not that far apart. It really isn't. That said, she is a bit overpowered, but I don't think she's extremely overpowered. But I think she is elite skewed a little bit more than we would like. And obviously, eating too much pick rate, eating too much ban rate, player perception tells us that Jinx is perceived to be OP, and so we should nerf Jinx. Okay, that's fine. So the point here is to tap her a bit under 1% in an elite skewed manner. So it's less R spam. 15 seconds off rank 1 R. I mean, I think 70 is just too short for a global ultimate, just period. I think 45 is okay. Keep in mind, level 16 is relatively fake on an 80 carry, don't get me wrong. So, it's really 55 to become 65 for the actual mid to late game for most part. But yeah, 50-second cooldown increase at rank 1 means you're not just spamming R to reset cooldowns and whatnot, and you're just going to have more downtime. And this is going to be some amount of win rate. I mean, we'll see. I don't expect it to be a ton, but I don't think she needs to lose more than 1% win rate. It is going to be a relatively small nerf. Yeah. Now, to be clear, Jinx will basically always have a high play rate. She's the main character of a popular TV show. And she's just, even before then, has always been a very, very popular ADC. Seeing Jinx have a higher play rate than Twitch is just a feature of her design is really good. Her visual design, gameplay design, this is a great champion. She's going to be popular. Yasuo is just going to be popular. He's going to have more play rate than Taliyah, always, because he's just cool. He's cool for most League of Legends players, and so he's going to have play rate. Jinx is going to be in a similar boat. She's going to have play rate just forever. People's going to rather enjoy this. They're going to enjoy it more than they're going to enjoy playing a Void Dog or a Stinky Rat. That's just the case. So play rate is not necessarily a problem. It's surges in play rate and surges in ban rate that suggest, okay, players think this champ is OP, thus we should act. Anyway. Nerf to R cooldown. Okay, great. Here you go. Here's the data table. Not a whole lot to say here, ultimately. It's plus 15, plus 10, plus 5. I can see this going from 90 to 50 at some point as well. But I don't mind this being a relatively spammy cooldown. Just, I think 70 is too short. And so the nerf going for here. Next are changes to Karma. And I actually want to call out something. If Karma players have noticed anything change about their champion back in 0.8 or 0.7, I think, I forget which. Karma seemed to have reliably lost win rate in the patch where I rescripted all of her abilities, and we should have simply strictly buffed R plus E. Now, keep in mind, there was also a patch where we nerfed Zazax and nerfed Mandate, and that, of course, also mattered, so there's a little bit of kind of back and forth going on here, but if there's any functionality here that's, kind of buggy or weird on Karma, let me know, okay? Because when I rescripted her, I, updated the logic flow in literally every single ability of how it looks up her data, and I stored the data differently in a more efficient manner that is easier to update going forward in the future. And so it's entirely possible that through some human error, I'm missing some root duration somehow, or the slow is not applying for the right amount of time or something. So let me know if it's actually happening. I don't believe it is, but she clearly lost win rate in a way that surprised me. And so Karma players will let me know if there's some weird oversight that I had, because apologies if so. Anyway, Karma is pretty weak. We're trying to let her be a viable support. There's an audience for Karma mid. I think that's great. If she has 2 roles, that's cool. That means we get to see more Karma. Karma tends to be a relatively unpopular champion, and so having a secondary role is a cool way to see Karma in more games. That's wonderful, right? If it's easy to support, we want to support it. Anyway, Karma is on the weak side, but we are cognizant of how overbearing mid lane Karma can be, so our buffs are support skewed, though of course mid Karma will enjoy them some. We're simply buffing the R plus E shield value, we're buffing the R plus E haste value, and we're buffing the slow on Q. This is relatively small. It's targeting about 1% win rate. It's not a ton here, but hey, extra power on Karma, encouraging her building a bit more Enchanter. Okay, great. Kassadin, relatively small nerf here, not much to say. 10% AP ratio off E, though again, E's base damage relatively low, so the AP ratio is doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this ability. Do some quick math on Kassadin E damage. His probably secondary damage tool going down 4 to 8% is, a meaningful amount of change. A little bit of win rate. Malzahar, definitely deserving of buffs. I know players have been asking for these for a while. We could have gone to this sooner. Time's been limited. Sorry about that. But once again, trying to go for things that it's a nice to have, but not required. But it's nice to have when you can flatten out MMR skew in ways that make sense, that aren't just ham-fisted. So Malzahar is right now very low MMR skewed. I wouldn't mind giving him some power in higher MMRs. It makes him feel kind of non-viable in higher elos. So hey, kind of freebie. And then 2, it's well, okay, that would be nice. What's there that would do this? And then identifying, actually, there's a bunch of things that kind of feel bad about Malzahar. 80 mana is, I think, just too much for a rank 1 spell in most contexts, so 60 to 80 is just freebie. This could have been 50 to 70 or something, but whatever. 60 to 80 is just going to feel whatever for a whole large portion of the game. Up to level 13 is a strict buff. And then Malefic Visions is getting buffed champion level 1 through 8, which is also an early game buff. So both of these are going to buff him in high MR more than low, but also just feel a lot better. Having a not 50-second cooldown is a very nice thing that feels a lot better to have going on. Hooray, your cooldowns feel a lot nicer when you're playing the laning phase. Hooray, your Q doesn't cost you a million mana when you're playing the laning phase out. Hooray, you're going to feel better. Ultimately, here is the cost difference on Q, again, until level 13. Cooldown difference on E, again, to level 9. But yeah, the goal here is that it's meant to feel really, really good. It will happen to be high MR skew, which is nice because he's already pretty bad in higher MRs, and he gets to feel better to play. Master Yi is actually not easy to play. He actually has a pretty decent mastery curve, and so he doesn't really deserve an inflated win rate of 50%. So we're going to try to push him toward a 50% win rate right now. This is being done by taking down power that we think is unneeded on him, which is extremely strong early game dueling power by taking 10 damage off of E. This will nerf his early clear, of course, as well. But at a certain point, the bonus AD ratio will take over, his item will take over, and the flat treatment will just mean less overall to the champion, and so it'll just mean less as we go towards late game. I don't believe we've made a strong determination on if we should make Master Yi easier to play, removing the timing tests on W and just give him like a bunch of base stats. Say go have fun. You're just like strong and just learn to be coordinated if you want to beat him. I don't think we've made a strong determination here. But it is something we certainly could do, is give the champion less agency, make him much worse at higher MRs, and make him much better at lower MRs by just giving him some dumb base stats. Not sure what we're going to do, if we're going to do that at all, but for now, Master Yi is relatively flat across MR and actually relatively hard to play, or averagely hard to play, I should say. Olaf is slated for nerfs for top lane, but would like to buff him, or at least keep him power neutral in the jungle. And so the strict top lane nerfs are -5 damage on Q, as well as -0, -5, -10 armor MR on the passive on R. I talked about the reasons why in the patch preview video. End of the day, there's some nerfs. Olaf is currently elite skewed, which is why early game damage on Q is meant to do that a little bit here, nerf his landing phase. But we are compensating the jungle because, of course, this is a strict nerf in all cases, and so is this. And so jungle is getting +5 to straight compensate, and then an extra 5, 10, 15, 20 on the Q as sort of fake compensation for this. Just means that Olaf's mid-game jungle clear is going to be very, 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 very fast. Okay, fine, have fun, buddy. Have a good time with that one. We're not buffing his first clear anymore. His first clear is already quite good, but second clear on was going to be quite a bit nicer for Olaf to try to maintain the win rate that we lose from losing PvP damage and losing some durability on R. Pyke is also fairly overperformant. One thing that I've noticed, we have a bunch of data on this, is casts per game of W goes up a lot with both MMR and Mastery. And so bad Pyke players don't press W as often, and low MMR Pyke players don't press W as often. And so for a champion who is overperforming in higher MMR more than lower MMR, taking down a tool that is used much more in high MMR play, such as, the ability to bypass wards and whatnot, right? All very powerful things. Average solo player is going to miss him on the minimap in a lot of cases and whatnot. So anyway, yeah, a nerf because Pyke is overperformant and skewed towards higher MR play. Moving on to Seraphine. Now, I know this context says like, hey, we can make her one of the higher damage supports. So keep in mind, right, Seraphine's primary player base is indeed in support. And one thing that's actually worth noting is that item builds for Seraphine bot, APC, and Seraphine support are actually very, very similar. They both tend to go Saras Rylace. They both tend to build the same stuff, and also the amount of gold they each earn is really close. The average bot lane Seraphine gains a bit over 10k, and the average Seraphine support earns a bit over 9k. So gold scaling in general is actually going to be relatively neutral across roles here, which I think is actually quite neat because it means that we can use gold scaling buffs and hit both bot lane Seraphine and support Seraphine equally. Support Seraphine is basically right at 50%. Bot lane Seraphine is basically right at 52% win rate. Often these like relatively unpopular like mage bot laners can sit at like 53 before players really get offended here. And most enchanters can sit at 51 or higher before, well, like, again, still feeling like totally reasonable champions to face. Now, this might be incorrect long-term, and Seraphine is not meant to be one of the 51 club in support. That might be true. And she might not be in the 53 club in bot lane. That might also be true. But we're trying this out, right? We're seeing if Seraphine can be 53 in bot and 51 in support. And if players don't rebel, then this appears to be a reasonable resting win rate for her. To eat the win rate that is left by auto-filled Blitzcranks and second most played support in the game, Nautilus, who's sub 50 in every MMR bracket and whatnot, right? Someone's got to eat that win rate. Oftentimes it can be enchanters. Okay. At the end of the day, picking AP ratio as it is a lever that I know Seraphine players like. They like building ability power. They like dealing high damage. And so saying that, yes, Seraphine, obviously a lot of your output is going to be supportive. You have crowd control through E and R. You obviously have team shielding and healing and haste through W. But you also have damage outputs. And so, she is more damage skewed than the average enchanter. Yep, okay, fine. She is not as damaging as Lux or Vel'Koz or Xerath. Yep, okay, true. And as long as she's pretty comfortably between those two spaces, then her overall power ratios are in kind of the right spots. Okay. On to Taliyah. Taliyah is obviously a really, really big pro play champion. We could have made these nerfs sooner and had Taliyah nerfs in for MSI. Ultimately, we didn't, but we're nerfing her for solo queue. She happens to also be good in pro play, but we're doing this because of solo queue, actually. She is very, very high win rate in high MR solo queue, especially in mid lane, also so in jungle. The changes here are meant to be bigger nerfs in mid lane than in jungle. Junglers don't tend to care about mana cost nerfs. This jungle nerf is not that big overall. End of the day, let's do the math here on what's going on here. So here is the mana cost of Q. Now, to be clear, this is the not worked ground Q. If half of all of Taliyah's Qs are worked ground, the actual mana cost of Q is going up like 7%, not 14%, because half of the Qs cost 10 mana instead, or 20 mana instead, which is not getting changed. So this is really like, I guess it's 90 becomes 100. Actually, oh, that's the funny thing. I just realized. We can just say, let's just add both together, and it's closer to this, right? It's closer to like 11% more if you're doing a Q plus a work ground Q. Okay, great. Anyway, whatever. Other thing is the monster damage on Q itself. As I mentioned, I'm a big fan of flat damage increases, ones that let you make your first clear feel good, but then not just shattering the jungle every time you run through at that point. So nerfing the AP ratio specifically on the jungle monster bonus damage here. This is the math in terms of what your full channel Q does as a result with expected ability power coming in. Doesn't affect your first clear very, very much, but hey, as you get to 2-3 items, it can be quite a bit of damage down here because the monster ratio here does not have fall off. Moving on to Twitch. Twitch is extremely overperformant. I think he's probably the second strongest marksman type, actually maybe third strongest behind Neela and Kog'Maw, but Twitch is extremely, extremely OP. He's always going to be a little bit rare because he's just not that appealing to play, I suppose, but the champion is really, really strong. He's also very meaningfully elite skewed, and so reshaping his base stats to be sort of more average in line for a marksman is kind of a free way to say here, have less elite skew, because early laning phases tend to be elite skewed. 630 base health. He's still actually quite good armor as well. I think it's 28. That's high for a marksman. He's actually still slightly on the durable end. Ultimately, my belief of Twitch, from both playing him a bunch in seasons past and playing alongside and against several this season, is Twitch is actually low-key a lane bully. Not like in the sense that, like Callista and Lucian and whatnot, but that basically anytime Twitch ducks in a fog, he presses Q for 40 mana and then has 10 seconds of, if he doesn't show up back on the wave, you have to respect a champ with 680 base health with a, like a 30% bonus attack speed when he comes out, and then obviously the easy follow-up on E, and it's like, he actually just outduels you if his support's paying attention. It's why, like, Yuumi and Lulu and stuff are really good enchanters with Twitch, because they can very reliably just sit in lane, and then they can play their full kit at full power with Twitch already being on the back line, and you're screwed, and he's forced the 2v1. Twitch is low-key a high agency laner. His, like, straight up 1v1, 2v2 was not that great, but he has a lot of windows every wave reset to find the 2v1, the 1v1, the whatever, and get a lot done. Or actually he dips and he roams. He dipped and he roamed, and you were hiding off the wave and not shoving it because he might have attacked you. But no, he actually went mid, so you're like, oh shit, I gotta shove the wave. Too late, right? You're not gonna crash it in time because second wave's already reinforcing. Like, Twitch has a lot of agency over his early lane. And so by taking down some of this 1v1 power in the early game, we take down some of Twitch's early lane agency, and again, in an elite skewed manner where he can kind of just stat check you in the early game in higher MMR play. The next change is meant to be just 10 damage off R. This is not a huge deal. It is meant to be win right down, though, of course, don't get me wrong. And then the consideration was that we thought this might have made AP Twitch the better build. We don't want AP Twitch to be better than AD Twitch, so we took a very, very small cursory AP ratio nerf on a W, which is going to hold very little win rate impact, but we'll do something, and that means literally nothing if you're AD Twitch. So AD Twitch has some health loss that he gets compensated more by like level 15, and then 10 damage on R. So let's do the math. Twitch's HP before and after. Again, level 15 is the break even here. Okay, great. If you are building AP, here's a slow on W. Okay, great. And this is, by the way, including a Doran's Blade, 100 base health here at level 1. And then Twitch's total attack damage during R being down by 10 is a bit less, right? Like, he's doing, 5-ish% less damage during R. I had the math when we were doing this stuff internally. I had written down what percent of Twitch's damage comes from R. I believe it's only about 25%. And so about 25% of Twitch's damage is down by about 5%, means Twitch is doing about 1% less damage in the course of a total game. And so in general, again, not that huge of a deal. It's, of course, win rate down. It's meant to be. He's losing about 1-ish% win rate from this. He's losing, 1-ish% win rate from this since it's getting compensated. Yeah, Twitch is going to lose quite a bit of win rate. He's going to be one of the bigger win rate losses this patch. That's fine. Urgot, the last of the overperformers we are nerfing this patch, taking his armor growth down by 0.45. Urgot has, I think, the third highest level 18 armor in the game. That seems very weird for a champion who is, though being short range, is still range. I don't think he needs to be skewed that heavily toward armor, that heavily anti-AD. Also, Urgot is low MMR skewed, and growth stats are low MMR skewed. So again, right, we can hit, MMR goals, or sorry, MMR skew pretty cleanly with things that also make sense for League of Legends of the game without much of a problem here. The last thing I want to bring up is that we are intentionally skipping on Kog'Maw. Kog'Maw was also slated for AD carry nerfs alongside Jinx, alongside Neela, alongside Twitch. Ultimately, though, we are removing Lethal Tempo from the game in patch 14.10, and so Kog will be OP for one more patch, but unlike Twitch and Jinx and all the other champions, these champs all seem to have fallback keystones that seemed about as performant as LT. Kog'Maw did not seem to, and so we expect Kog'Maw to lose quite a lot of win rate in 14.10, and if he doesn't, then we'll just do whatever nerfs, but didn't want to take much power down just for the 14, right, it's like, we can spend the effort researching and figuring out changes and QAing them and doing all this stuff, or we leave him alone for 14 days because he's going to lose win rate anyway, and then we have to rebuff him regardless, so why do the work twice for the sake of, like, a 2% pick rate champion is OP for one more patch? Oh well. Intentional change to leave him out of the patch for that reason. Okay, cool. That's going to mostly be it. Not going to bring up much else here. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time. Bye-bye.